I'm Whit Fosberg. I'm the president and CEO at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And I want to welcome everybody to TRCP's 7th annual Saltwater Media Summit, which will be happening right now and then again tomorrow. This will be the 5th time in a row we've done this at ICAST, and I just want to talk about what a great partner American Sport Fishing Association is to help host this with us and to really give conservation the profile that we think it deserves as a part of this great fishing show. So we got involved with these media summits for a very simple reason. A lot of these issues that we deal with, including the ones we'll talk about today and tomorrow, are pretty complicated. And particularly in the world we're living in right now with COVID and the racial unrest and a lot of other things going on in this country, these are issues that really don't make it into the papers anymore. So, and they're not simple issues. So we hope folks will do is tune in, learn something here, hear from some of the experts, hear from some of the members of Congress. They're dealing with these issues right now. And at a minimum, know where you can turn to get more information. Because we count on you all, especially in the media, and also corporate sponsors to help get this information out there. Now, I would be remiss not to acknowledge all the folks that make this possible. You see them on your screen right now, including NOAA, the state of Florida, American Sport Fishing Association, Bass Pro, Costa, Peak Design, and others. And we couldn't do this without you all, so thank you. And for those of you who are just joining in for the fun of it, support those great companies. I want to introduce Chris Macaluso now. Chris will be our moderator for the panel today. He is the director for the Center for Marine Fisheries at TRCP. He has been doing this for 5 years in a row now at ICAST and has got this down pretty well. So with that, Chris, let me turn over to you and I will turn myself off.
Thank you, Whit, and thanks to everyone out there for joining us. As Whit mentioned, this is the 5th year that we've done this, and we've had great success in hosting this event and in getting some of the messaging of conservation and hunting and fishing out to the media generally when they attend ICAST. Of course, this year being online, we've had to change things up a little bit, but I think we've got a good discussion for you today. A reminder for those of you who are tuning in, if you would like to ask questions, please do so. Please type them in. You will not be able to ask them verbally, but you can type them in and we will address them as they come in once our panel has had a chance to discuss. A reminder about tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about modernizing and improving menhaden management, especially as it relates to what's going on in the Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay. It will be at the same time. For those of you who would like to attend, please do so. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. The TRCP has been working with its partners, its sport fishing partners, its hunting partners, with state and federal agencies for the last few months to talk about how an economic stimulus plan coming out of the federal government can benefit conservation and create jobs. We have been very conscious of the fact of what the COVID-19 pandemic has done in our country in terms of the economic downturn, in terms of people losing their jobs, and in terms of what Congress has had to address thus far. And we want to make sure that folks understand that that's the priority for us still, that we understand Congress's focus right now needs to be on limiting the spread of the coronavirus, in addressing and taking care of those who are sick, and in making sure that folks can pay their bills and stay afloat. But we also understand that a lot of jobs have been lost and they continue to be lost through this process of having to deal with this. And we know that the federal government in some way is going to try to stimulate the economy through creating jobs, through investments in infrastructure construction, in water resources development and management, to try to get people back to work, doing construction work, with federal dollars that have been infused into the economy. We want to make sure that habitat restoration, conservation, hunting and fishing priorities are addressed in any potential stimulus package or any infrastructure bills that come out. And so that's what we've been working with our partners on, in understanding that there needs to be some patience, but also in making sure that our priorities are well represented in federal stimulus efforts. We have invited Congressman Garrett Graves from Louisiana to join us. We've also invited Congressman Jared Huffman. When we made those invitations, we didn't realize that the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee would be marking up the Water Resources Development Act today. But we do have a video from Congressman Huffman that we'll show shortly, as well as a video. Hopefully we'll be joined by Congressman Graves here in the next few minutes as he steps away from the committee meeting and hopefully can join us via video or via phone. Just a couple of introductions. Congressman Huffman represents California's 2nd District, which is Northern California from San Francisco north to Oregon. He chairs the subcommittee on waters, ocean, and wildlife in the House. And he, again, is marking up the WRDA bill today on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Congressman Garrett Graves represents Louisiana's 6th Congressional District, which includes the Baton Rouge area, some areas between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and down to the coast. Before being elected to Congress, he was also the chairman of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority in Louisiana, and he is he's also the recipient of this year's TRCP Capital Conservation Award, which he will receive along with Congressman Mark Vesey of Texas in September during our virtual Conservation Awards dinner. Scott Kirkpatrick is joining us today. Scott is the president of the Coast Builders Coalition, which represents about 20 dredging engineering firms and heavy equipment providers that work on coastal habitat restoration. He's located here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he is a former staffer for Senators John Breaux and Congressman Richard Baker. He also served as a natural resources and transportation policy advisor to Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco. Steve Kline is joining us as well. He is TRCP's Chief Policy Officer. He joined the partnership in April of 2011. He spent his entire professional career on Capitol Hill working on a variety of conservation issues. So with that, what I'll do is turn it over to a video that was recorded by Congressman Huffman, and we will await the arrival of Congressman Garrett Graves as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and the American Sports Fishing Association for hosting this discussion and for inviting me to participate. I want to apologize for not being able to join you in person for the webinar today, but I am glad to have the chance to highlight the importance of some restoration and natural infrastructure work that we've been doing in Congress. As you probably heard, the House Democrats Select Committee on the Climate Crisis recently unveiled our massive climate action plan. And it might seem like an odd time for us to release a report like that. A global pandemic is raging. We're battling with the struggle for racial justice, and our economy is tanking all at the same time, and all of this is in everyone's minds. But the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Action Plan lays out a comprehensive framework for how to combat climate change, including creating jobs and stimulating the economy to build a more healthy, just, and resilient America. And restoration and natural infrastructure are key pillars of that report. Now, restoration projects and investments in natural infrastructure obviously support healthy ecosystems while providing job opportunities, supporting the outdoor recreation economy, but also mitigating the impacts of climate change. There's a long history of the federal government supporting restoration efforts to create jobs and to stimulate economic development. Investments in restoration work have outsized economic and environmental benefits compared to their initial investment. We know restoration efforts are labor intensive. They require skills and experience. And investment in these projects goes toward labor and creating jobs, something our economy desperately needs right now. Restoring natural coastal infrastructure like salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, these things remove carbon from the atmosphere. They help to mitigate climate change, and they also provide habitat for fish and wildlife while helping increase the resilience of coastal communities. So my colleague Garrett Graves has been a champion of restoration in the Gulf, and I got to see this up close when I visited him in Louisiana a few months back. Coastal recreation is just as important in California, and in particular, salmon restoration means a lot to us here in my North Coast district. I know all of you understand the key connection between healthy habitat and healthy fisheries, and I'd like to just talk for a moment about why this is such a high priority for me. In my Northern California district, salmon aren't just in our rivers. They're part of our history, our culture, our way of life. We're salmon people. The North Coast is home to many tribes that have relied on salmon since time immemorial for subsistence, culture, ceremony, and of course their livelihoods. Commercial and recreational fishers depend on healthy salmon populations, and their fishing activities connect all of us to this shared resource, whether we're enjoying a day on the water or just eating a delicious grilled salmon fillet. Now, unfortunately for us here in California, a lot of our salmon populations are at risk. From climate change to habitat loss, salmon are facing a lot of challenges. But here's the great thing about salmon. If you give them good conditions, clean water, with fish passage and healthy habitat, they thrive. And when they thrive, our commercial fisheries, our guides, our recreational anglers, our coastal communities and tribes also thrive. That's why investing in restoration of these habitats is so important. So going back now to the Climate Action Plan, we included several restoration recommendations, including a focus on blue carbon ecosystems, those things like mangroves and salt marshes that I mentioned earlier, and also increased investments in natural infrastructure to protect coastal communities and ecosystems from the impacts of climate change, things like sea level rise and increased storms and flooding. The recommendations in this plan maximize the climate benefits of ocean and coastal ecosystems while also providing the co-benefits of habitat protection and community resilience. Now, a lot of the concepts in the bills outlined in the Climate Action Plan will also stimulate the economy, and many are already on paper. Some have even passed out of the House. H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, just passed at the end of June, and it includes a $3 billion coastal resiliency grant program for shovel-ready projects to restore Great Lakes and coastal habitats, to restore habitat for fish and wildlife, and assist in adaptation to climate change. This is a big thing, I know, for my friend Garrett Graves in Louisiana. We're going to focus on projects that stimulate the economy and create jobs as we do that. Now, I also led a letter for a Restoration and Resilience Jobs title in our COVID-19 recovery legislation. This was with my colleagues Debbie Dingell and Raul Grijalva, because we think this could be a huge job creator. And one of the provisions in that letter included the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This is a bill that was passed as an amendment to H.R. 2. It makes significant investments in habitat restoration for species recovery, and also in natural infrastructure to create wildlife, boost community resilience, and create jobs. Now, last December, the House also passed a package of 10 bipartisan coastal resilience bills, and I don't want to forget that, because they included some important provisions to support local community projects that protect and restore and preserve coastal zones, working waterfronts, and fish habitat. As the country continues to struggle with high unemployment as a result of this pandemic, we need to continue investing in natural infrastructure and restoration projects to rebuild local workforces and support communities. So thank you for including me in this conversation and for being so engaged on these important issues and for moving restoration efforts forward in your communities. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you to Congressman Huffman for that great video. We're still trying to get Congressman Graves to join us this morning, but we'll continue the conversation until he joins us, and then we'll give him the opportunity to address things from his side of the aisle. One thing I wanted to point out is that the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership has several conservation habitat priorities right now. In the marine fisheries department here, the Center for Marine Fisheries, we're working with a host of other conservation and angling advocacy groups to try to expedite coastal restoration work here in the Mississippi River Delta, where I am, but also the Everglades, which is a high priority for us. During this process of engaging with Congress on priorities during the COVID-19 crisis, we have sent a letter up to Congress asking for their continued and increased financial support of Everglades restoration efforts. We know that infusing more money into Everglades restoration is going to mean jobs. And that was the emphasis of our letter. And that's what we're trying to push. to try to get some of these projects on the ground. We also know that as you build coastal restoration projects, whether it be mangrove restoration, seagrasses, marsh, barrier island restoration projects, which we're doing a lot of here in Louisiana right now, the sooner you can address these restoration projects, the less expensive they are. The more you let this habitat languish, the more you let it degrade, the more expensive it is to come back and restore it. So infusing money into getting these projects on the ground quicker is a wise investment, and infusing money into it in large sums rather than parsing it out over a long period of time is a wise investment as well, because a lot of the cost in building these restoration projects is involved in the mobilization and the demobilization of the equipment needed to build the projects. So with that, I want to turn it over to Scott Kirkpatrick and ask him a couple of questions from the perspective of the organizations and the companies that he represents with coast builders. Scott, when the federal government or a state government infuses money into a habitat restoration project, how does that translate down to the companies you represent in terms of the number of people they can hire, the amount of jobs they can create, and the amount of money they can put back into the economy in a short period of time?
Yeah, great. Chris, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we hear you great.
All right, super. Well, this is a tremendous opportunity, I think, to that we have in the nation. Like you, I love some of the things you said just about the deteriorating situation we have with some of our restoration projects and the time to kind of put some emergency dollars to use. I think one of the biggest things that companies see when the federal government or state government acts on this is suddenly they can plug some certainty into their business plan. They're all looking at, 1, 2, 3-year business plans. And the greater certainty they have, the better they feel about making investments in people and equipment, et cetera. And as we all know, now is a time of relative uncertainty in a number of areas. And so federal action in particular in this area could be tremendous for whether it be a consulting firm making some decisions about bringing on some staff or some new folks coming out of college, or whether it's a construction firm making a decision about buying new equipment. That level of certainty that could come from a federal stimulus would be tremendous at this time of pretty good uncertainty. I will say, as I've talked to our members about what they're seeing during this time, they've noted that in a lot of ways where a number of the consulting firms can telework, and that's allowed them to continue working on their things. A number of construction firms have been deemed essential, and they are doing their work outside, and so they have not been limited. But the biggest concern has been, will the owners start slowing down what they're pushing out? And I think in some ways that's what you're looking at and talking about. Do the owners, in terms of, let's say, federal government or state government, whoever is pushing out the project, are they able to keep the pace up and put those jobs out?
Well, Scott, the companies that you represent, which include some of the largest dredging companies in the world, like Great Lakes Dredge and Dock, Weeks Marine, some of these are large companies that I think are a little bit more insulated from financial downturn than maybe some of the other companies that you represent, which are smaller firms that maybe don't have the same capital available to them. Learning some lessons from the past, because there have been federal stimuluses in the past. We know in 2009, there was an effort to infuse a lot of money into quote unquote shovel-ready projects to get them on the ground and hopefully, improve the nation's economy. Learning some of those lessons and looking back, how do you get that money to trickle down into some of those smaller companies to make sure that they're on solid footing, the same way as some of the larger businesses might be?
Yeah, I think you often find, whether it be at the federal level, state level, or local level, there is a good sensitivity about supporting small businesses, in some ways supporting local businesses. So in a lot of ways, some of those protections are already built in that ultimately, if you do put money towards projects, a lot of some protections and accommodations for small businesses should already be there. So I would think those would translate in many ways. I do think that small companies may not have the capital that bigger companies have, but often they're a little more nimble too. And in this environment, that being nimble may also be a bit of an advantage. And so I think it's a great sensitivity you point out, Chris. I think the public and politicians want to, if they make these investments, they want to believe that ideally people, their constituents are benefiting, and that ultimately that money is being put back into the community, into companies in their community that are doing the projects. And so I just think they would need to continue to rely on maybe some of the small business accommodations that are hopefully already kind of there and apparent in these conservation projects.
Steve, I'd like to turn to you now and ask you a little bit about, your perspective from being up on Capitol Hill, from working with congressional staff on a daily basis on some of this legislation. We know today the House is the Transportation Infrastructure Committee is marking up the Water Resource Development Act. We know that there are some strong conservation priorities in that bill, including some mitigation efforts, efforts to mitigate from impact of Corps of Engineers projects on waterways for fisheries, to increase fish passages in dams and other water infrastructure. There are some Everglades provisions in the bill that we've been supportive of and that we've worked with our partners. Give us a little bit of insight as to what's going on with that bill from the House and the Senate perspective, and also touch on what you think the potential is for another jobs creation infrastructure package this Congress, and if not this Congress, maybe the following year.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. As Congressman Huffman mentioned, the reason why he couldn't be here in person today, and Congressman Graves as well, is because the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is marking up the 2020 Water Resources Development Act right now, and that's a bill that's really chock full of provisions that hunters and anglers can get excited about, including major incentives for nature-based infrastructure, which we've seen in so many places around the country, so-called blue or green infrastructure that works so much better during major storm events and some of these climactic impacts than traditional gray infrastructure. So the bill does a great job of incentivizing that. It's also got, I know this is important in Louisiana and in the Chesapeake Bay where I'm from. It's also got provisions incentivizing the use of a dredge material, beneficial use of dredge material. So instead of taking the dredge material that they're dredging out of the Baltimore Harbor and New Orleans and taking that out to open water and dumping it, there is incentives for using that material in places where it can be used to build new land, new islands, new coastal wetlands. And there's also a great provision that incentivizes the restoration of anadromous fish habitat and harmful algal blooms as well. And up and down the bill, you'll see reference to coastal resilience and natural infrastructure and things that our community can really get behind in a huge way. In terms of what's happening today, there is a four corners agreement, a very bipartisan agreement to support this bill through the floor. So what that means is that the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee that lead the committee, the chairman and the ranking member, and the relevant chair and ranking member of the subcommittee that wrote the bill are locking hands to support the bill's passage through the floor. So any amendments that come forward today in committee, or any amendments that come forward on the floor, which could happen and I think will happen before the August recess in the House, any of those amendments that are not, or changes that are not supported by all four of those bipartisan leaders of the committee will not be supported. So really, for the House in 2020, a very clean path forward to getting a bipartisan bill done, which is pretty rare in that chamber these days. When you contrast it to the House Highway Bill, which also includes a ton of great provisions, I wanted to flag a few that were absolutely critical for the sport fishing community. Certainly the reauthorization of the Sport Fish and Boating Trust Fund is in the House Highway Bill, and $3 billion, as Congressman Huffman mentioned, for Coastal Resilience Program, Living Shorelines projects as well. And a very important piece of the puzzle has been the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which also gets a major increase in the House Highway Bill. That has become a slightly more partisan bill. None of the partisanship stemming from any of the priorities that we care about. But when you look across the chamber, the aisle, the Capitol, to the Senate, they also have reported out a highway bill and a WRDA bill out of committee. Those bills passed out of committee unanimously, out of Environment and Public Works, 21-0, both of them. And they also have great provisions. The Senate WRDA bill's got an invasive species title that prioritizes and funds Asian carp and zebra mussels, among other invasive species. So we're excited about the potential for certainly a WRDA bill to come forward by the end of this Congress, I think, and be conferenced with the Senate. And the question, I think, now for congressional leaders is, can they get there on a highway bill, given that these bills are pretty different, House to Senate? And to your question, Chris, about what economic stimulus looks like this year yet, this Congress, the clock is certainly ticking on that. For folks that may be watching what leadership says, there is some sense that the Senate is going to have a stimulus bill, or a supplemental bill, I should say, emergency bill, yet this month in July. But all indications are that that bill will stick to the four corners of COVID response. So funding the states and municipalities, testing, limiting the liability of employees and employers, and I think also funding to help get kids back in school. So I don't think we're going to see a big infrastructure or stimulus push that would include the priorities we're talking about today this summer, but I think there is a sporting chance that we get there by the end of the year. And looking ahead to kind of the lame duck and the potential for things to shift dramatically on election day, we remain cautiously optimistic that the next 6 to 8 months could include a major recovery investment.
Thanks, Steve. One thing I'd like to add to the discussion is that, when we talk about infusing federal dollars, especially in the case of like coastal restoration here in Louisiana, it doesn't necessarily have to be, directly providing money to the state. It can be the forgiveness of a payback provision, for instance, which would free up additional funds to be committed more towards restoration work. In the case of Louisiana, Louisiana, I think, has been negotiating with the federal government for the last several years to forgive a payback provision for the hurricane protection system around the city of New Orleans. That's going to potentially tie up hundreds of millions of dollars in state money over the next several decades that could be committed to restoration efforts as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, coming in the form of a check written directly to the states. And the same case could be made for the Everglades as well. If some of the state federal cost shares were forgiven, then you would have the opportunity to invest that money pretty quickly into projects that would restore the habitat, rather than having to go back, rather than having to go to pay the federal government. We do have one question so far, and this is from Rob Southwick. He says, for years we heard from many elected officials that it's jobs or conservation, meaning that conservation investments, including restoration, were economic drags and wouldn't help grow jobs and tax revenues. This seems to be changing, but do you still see elements adhering to this outdated dogma? And how do we help them understand that healthy resources equate to jobs and economic growth? Scott, I'll open that up to you. I mean, I think that's right there in your wheelhouse. This is something you've been dealing with your entire career. And I think we understand clearly, those of us who've seen the folks on site, the equipment that has to be purchased, the people that's needed to run this equipment, and engineering, design, and everything that goes into to building these conservation projects, not to mention the benefit you get afterwards in terms of increasing public access or increasing fishing opportunities. We've seen the economic activity. What's the best way to convince lawmakers that these are wise investments?
Yeah, so it's a great question from Rob, and I think detractors will continue to kind of try to rely on that a bit. But what's great for our cause, I think, is we have a number of examples of just successful investments, and that can be anywhere from the stimulus, post-stimulus stuff with the recession in 08, 09, also along the Gulf Coast, the Deepwater Horizon investments, really over 15 years. But what they've done for jobs along the Gulf Coast and restoration projects has been tremendous. And there are a number of studies out there that highlight, how $1 million in restoration conservation projects leads to 15 to 20 to 25 jobs, depending on the type of project. And so we've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of facts to back up what we're talking about here. And I think that helps our advocacy a whole lot.
Well, and to add to that, the conservation community, the hunting and fishing organizations, and several environmental groups, we had to work real hard to secure things like the Restore Act, post-oil spill, to get the bulk of the fines that were going to be handed down to the violating parties, BP and Transocean and others, to be committed to restoration projects along the Gulf Coast that would increase public access to quality habitat, that would increase the habitat quality here, that would address the damage both from a habitat perspective and an ecosystem perspective from the oil spill, but also an economic perspective. And that money is starting to be, there were some lawmakers at the time who thought that those fines ought to go to maybe balancing the federal budget, or maybe to other priorities, other agency priorities. And right now we're starting to see the rewards of that effort to get that money committed. We've got a roughly $200 million Mississippi River diversion project that's going to be built into a massive area of swamp, most of which is public land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And that money is coming directly from money that came here through the Restore Act. So just, it takes some convincing sometimes to let these folks know, the lawmakers and the policymakers, to let them know that the money is going to be put on the ground. But now that we've got examples of that money being invested in conservation and the jobs that it produces, I think we could move forward in getting more money invested in these projects. We've got another question. Go ahead, Steve.
Well,
Sorry.
I was just going to say, Chris, this doesn't have to be theoretical, right? I mean, looking at, you made mention of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009. That money's all been spent, obviously, and we've got pretty strong economic numbers from what that money did from the Office of Management and Budget. So OMB estimates that for every $100 billion invested by the ARRA bill, there were 1.1 million jobs created. So that's it's a job for roughly every $100,000 the federal government invested in that, in those variety of programs, and a lot of line items that are right in the wheelhouse of our community. $2 billion for Army Corps projects were included in ARRA. There's $375 million for the Mississippi River and tributaries alone. And I think it's important for folks to understand that these are jobs at all levels of the economic spectrum, from heavy equipment operators, engineers, welders, to entry-level biologists and field technicians. They are non-exportable, good-paying jobs.
That's exactly right. And hopefully that that is infusing money into communities that were affected by the oil spill, that were been affected by hurricanes, places where you've had economic downturns, not just from COVID-19, but from other acts that have affected people's ability to go to work. We've got a question from Noah Glick. How important is the Great American Outdoors Act in helping to invest in conservation. Steve, I'll throw that one to you.
Sure, thanks. So the Great American Outdoors Act, for folks that maybe are uninitiated, includes mandatory funding, so non-appropriated dollars for the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million a year. And LWCF has been now authorized permanently. So that money would flow to LWCF in perpetuity until Congress made some reform to stop it. They would have to act to stop it, that funding. And the other piece of the Great American Outdoors Act is the establishment of a public lands legacy fund that would begin over the course of 5 years, just under $10 billion over those 5 years of, again, mandatory funding, so non-appropriated dollars. It would not depend on the appropriators appropriating the money. Would be spent on the deferred maintenance backlog on our public lands. I see Congressman Graves might be joining us, Chris, so I'll perhaps turn it over to him.
Congressman Graves, are you with us?
This is Dustin. I'm just logging on before the Congressman gets ready to head on.
Okay.
I'll wrap up real quick then on Great American Outdoors Act. Great American Outdoors Act is certainly a piece of the job stimulus and recovery universe. Certainly when we talk about addressing the roughly $20 billion backlog on all of our public land agency lands across the country, it is critically important that we begin to address that, because it's an access problem for sportsmen and women, for hunters and anglers being locked out of public lands. And certainly it will be a huge piece and a huge job creator on that front, the same kind of jobs that we're talking about. And when TRCP back in March was first asked by Congress to outline our recovery priorities, the Great American Outdoors Act led our list of priorities. Just for folks that maybe aren't paying as much attention to that as others, that bill has been reported out of the Senate, passed by the Senate on strong bipartisan numbers, and it is slated to be taken up in the House next week, where we anticipate passage by also strong bipartisan numbers, and to be signed into law by the president probably before the August recess. So a historic legislative accomplishment for sure.
Steve, while we're waiting on Congressman Graves to join us, we have been successful in working with several organizations, and there's been a lot of success in getting a broader commitment from the federal government in Everglades restoration, especially a financial commitment. We saw a $200 million commitment last year. We had assurances that it would go up to about $250 million this year, though certainly coronavirus may have thrown a bit of a wrench into that. What do you think the prospects are of maintaining that level of funding, that $200 to $250 million for Everglades restoration in the next fiscal year?
I think the odds are strong that we will maintain it. The House and the Senate are moving forward with appropriations right now. There is a strong funding for the Everglades in the energy and water bill appropriations legislation. And I'll say that there's also this issue of new starts to make sure that these Everglades restoration projects aren't considered new starts by the Army Corps. An important but somewhat complicated bureaucratic definition that we are trying to durably fix, and positive language there in the appropriations bill as well. So I think so far the appropriations process has been good for the Everglades. And I think as we look ahead to perhaps the end of the fiscal year, at the end of the month in September, we're probably looking for a continuing resolution, which will ensure that there is not a government shutdown, a federal government shutdown on October 1st. And I anticipate, if that were to happen, the continuing resolution, we would see Everglades funding maintained, and then would look towards an omnibus funding bill that would pass all of the appropriations bills that have been done so far, and could include that plus up of Everglades funding to $250 million. So, but I think the outlook is good for Everglades funding.
Thanks, Steve. Just a reminder to folks, if you want to write in questions, you can type them in and we'll get to them as they come in. Congressman Graves should be logging on with us here shortly. I think that was his staff logging in just to make sure that the link was working, and he is stepping away right now to join us. So please type in your questions and we'll get to them as they come. Scott, what does the prospect look like right now without a stimulus for some of your companies in terms of being able to continue their work, as things stand? How are things for the companies that are working on coastal restoration issues right now and projects? I know that, in the state of Louisiana in particular, the state is anticipating spending about $3 billion over the next 3 years. Now, that was before the economic downturn, before oil prices dropped out, because some of that money I know was coming from the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act funds that were coming from offshore oil and gas development. But still, an estimation of $3 billion, and a large part of that coming from the oil spill recovery money, the fines, that's a lot of money to be investing in coastal habitat restoration.
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned earlier, I think conservation jobs are pretty healthy right now, a pretty good place. Consultants are able to generally get their work moved along. They can telework if they need to. They don't necessarily have to be in the office. The construction work generally can happen. It's outdoors. It's not restricted. So generally that they're not companies that I work with aren't getting hit by some of the other things that, let's say, restaurants and others are being hit by, just inhibitions because of the virus. Now, I think the big question mark, well, two big question marks. One is, are the agencies, are the owners able to continue to push projects out at the pace they had hoped to? Do they have some delays based on the virus that make projects slow down? Or in some cases, does funding, whether it be private or public funding, kind of begin to disappear? So that's that's kind of what we're seeing. Again, we believe and would say this is a great place to invest dollars because of a limit on inhibitions from because of the virus. So.
Steve, to you, when we say natural infrastructure, that can be a broad set of things. And you spent a lot of time working on the Farm Bill, working with the agricultural side, on private land investment. What does that look like just in general in terms of investing in natural infrastructure when it comes to private lands, when it comes to things that are happening in, say, the Prairie Pothole region, the Mississippi River Basin? What kind of projects are we talking about focusing investment on to improve habitat quality in those areas?
Sure. One of the things that I think is sort of most exciting is the idea of setback levees. So if you could think of, instead of having levees that are right on the riverbank, not allowing the river to flood its banks at all, these are kind of groundbreaking attempts to allow the river to use its floodplain and slow the river down and dump some of that sediment in places where it's needed instead of shooting it all down the river. And I think this is something that obviously requires private lands on the side of the river, easements, the development of ag conservation easements that can seek to make landowners, keep them whole as their lands are used for their initial, what they're there for, which is floodplains, some of this bottomland hardwood restoration that is critical for any number of ducks, wildlife, black bears in Louisiana. And that's, when we look at private lands, natural infrastructure, we look at sort of the easement programs that exist that allow, allow some of those natural uses. And one of the things that we say about natural infrastructure is that it just functions better over time. And its worst day is its first day. And it just keeps improving over time as things mature, as plantings mature, and as things develop. So it's really pretty exciting to think about. And we're starting to put together the case studies on the natural infrastructure front that illustrate just how well these systems perform under increased storm events that we expect to increase under climate change. Is how do these systems function better than traditional systems? Do they keep people safer? It's not just about, and this is the piece that Rob Southwick might have been alluding to, is it's not just about conservation. We're talking about keeping communities safe, keeping people alive, allowing emergency vehicles to get around during these events. And certainly one of the ancillary benefits of these projects is fish and wildlife habitat, but it's a lot more than that as well.
Well, we do have word from Congressman Graves that he is trying to join us. They are dealing with manager's amendments right now, so he may be a little tied up, but hopefully we can get him on here shortly before we wrap up here in the next 8 to 10 minutes. We did have one question related to trying to get some funds into the Gulf of Mexico for improving fisheries management. One of the priorities, and we will deal with this more so tomorrow in tomorrow's discussion about improving menhaden management, but that is a priority for our organization. There has been some stimulus dollars appropriated already to address some of the losses in fisheries. It's mainly targeted at the commercial fishing industry in terms of trying to address their inability to supply restaurants and the general economic downturn in the fisheries. What we'd like to see some investments made in is building some of the infrastructure in, to help process potentially new species. There was some talk earlier about Asian carp. I think there's been much more of an acceptance, throughout the country and in other parts of the world in eating these fish. In Asia, they eat them all the time. And I think one way we can try to limit the spread of and maybe keep the populations under control is to make some investments in places that can process and find markets for them. Just give opportunities for commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen, guides, give them opportunities to take advantage of the resources that are available. And I know Congressman Graves, in working with his office, they are interested in part of any stimulus package being an opportunity for licensed captains, guides, charter boat operators, commercial fishermen who've seen a downturn in their business. We know that even though fishing has been very popular, still throughout the coronavirus pandemic, throughout even the quarantines, that governors in some cases are still encouraging people to get out on the water. It's one of the few activities you can do where you can properly socially distance. You can stay with people in your household. You can be outside, which, reports say that that's the best place to be right now with the coronavirus spreading. And so I think, but we've still seen charter captains and guides losing economic opportunity, having people cancel trips because of the coronavirus. And I know Congressman Graves is interested in providing opportunity for them to work in other fields while the economy recovers. We are going to give him a couple of more minutes to join us, and then I think we're going to wrap up. We were trying to wrap this thing up by 11 o'clock, or by 11 o'clock Central, by noon Eastern. If you have any additional questions, please type them in, and we'll get to them. If not, if you will indulge us a couple of more minutes to allow Congressman Graves to join. If he's not able to, we apologize. But again, we didn't anticipate the bill being marked up today when we secured this panel. One thing I'd like to mention is that we will be having another discussion tomorrow. It's going to be on forage fish management and menhaden specifically. There is a different link for the public to join us for that conversation. So please look on the ICAST Conservation Series website, and you'll be able to find that link. Also, if you have questions for Congressman Huffman and for Congressman Graves related to this topic, we will gladly relay that to their staff as we wrap up things today. We will also make this webinar available for folks to watch again It will be archived, and if you have any questions about if you want to watch it again, we can make that available through the TRCP website. If there are no other questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. It was a valiant effort by Congressman Graves to join us today, and we apologize that he was not able to. But again, if you have questions for him, we will relay that to him and to his staff. I'd like to again thank our panelists for joining us today. Thank Congressman Huffman's staff for making his video available. Thank you to Scott for taking some time out of the day, and to Steve. We really appreciate it, and we'd like to thank our sponsors, NOAA, the American Sport Fishing Association, Bass Pro Shops, Costa Del Mar, Peak Design, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and PowerPole. Thanks to all of our sponsors. Thanks to you guys for joining us today. Please join us again tomorrow, and we will talk to you again. Thank you very much.